loaner computer, so I don't know what's going on with it. But okay, we're going to talk about trauma and the brain today. I'm really not a brain expert, but I did, as through my experiences with my kids and then working with other families, have realized how important it is to understand what's going on in the brain and understand how trauma affects it, because we expect the brain to be in charge, but it's working with wounds. And when we can understand what those wounds are, we can help the brain heal from those, and we can also work around those wounds to help our kids succeed. So
I'm so
yep.
sorry. Before we start, do you mind to tell me your credentials and your background? I work in crisis intervention for a long time in mental health, and so I'm really interested in this.
Sure, yeah. Well, my biggest credential is I'm a parent of a trauma-affected kid. Okay. And after about 10 years of battles and fights, and I discovered what at the time was called attachment parenting or trauma therapeutic parenting, mm-hmm. and learned from Karyn Purvis, Nancy Thomas, just started studying all of those. I eventually started a nonprofit that works with families running camps, and I went to Texas Christian University and completed their TBRI program there.
Okay, awesome.
So those are it's kind of my background. I've actually, at this point, I'm not working with any other organization for a job, but I just volunteer for different organizations like Rise Up, and that's short-term, a little bit of who I am.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you for sharing.
Sure. So the information that I've got here is all coming from TBRIs, coming from the Child Development Institute at TCU. And a lot of research just from learning about the brain through some of the big, Dan Siegel and Bruce Perry and some of those other giants out there who are really pioneering so much information about the brain. Basically, when we talk about trauma and the brain, understanding how the brain develops, starting from, of course, in utero, but up through even the first 3 years of life, the majority of the brain is developing rapidly at that time. Then it begins to slow down as children go. But to understand, the brain grows from the inside out. So we think about an infant, the brain stem, and as you can see, this red part of the brain where that is the basic survival. Some people call it lizard brain or reptile brain, to where, an infant just instinctually knows to crawl towards warmth or food, or so all of those survival instincts in us come from that brainstem. The next really primary part of the brain that develops, of course, this is super simplified. I'm not going to talk like a lot of brain terms. I try to use just a lot of more practical terms that can kind of help us understand what's going on in the brain, because so much of the brain is still not tangible. If we say the brain sends a message, well, what does that mean? We don't really even know all of what that means in the brain. But so I'll use a lot of more layman's terms. But this second section here, this purple section of the brain, is kind of where the amygdala is, which is really kind of our emotions. And we know that our kids are able to have and express emotions much earlier than they are able to kind of sort them out and organize them. But we have 2-year-olds who definitely are feeling anger or despair or happy or whatever. So really that middle part of the brain is the emotion part of our psyche, our brain. And then the outer core of our brain, in general, we would call it the neo cortex, the prefrontal cortex, the parts all out there in the blue part of the brain do things like logic, reason, language. It's really the thinking part of our brain. And obviously that develops last, as we're talking about the brain developing from the inside out. It's not that one gets done and the other starts, but as they're developing, the survival part of the brain is mostly developed by the time our children are 3. So as we think about the brain, we think about these 3 main parts, and really when we get into trauma, we're going to really kind of rope together the brain stem, the survival instincts, with the emotional, the second part of that middle part of the brain, to really kind of actually end up putting them in two categories. These are just some terms. I'll often say the survival part of the brain, the emotions, but the cerebral cortex here, the prefrontal lobe in the front of our brain is our thinking brain. So when we think about the brain as a message system, right, and it's telling the body what to do and how to act and what to think, and all three of these parts of the brain send very crucial messages to our bodies to know what to do. And really, most of the time, we can lump them into one of these three categories for the most part, whether something is for survival. I've got underwater, I need to get up for air. That survival part of the brain is going to tell my arms to push down to get me to swim, to get up. The emotions, I feel sad about something, I feel angry about something, and of course, reason, which is, you know, how we can use language and logic. When we talk about how the brain works, eventually, as the brain grows, each outer part of the brain, we want to become the boss. And this is terminology I use with families and kids, and it just makes more sense to me. So when I talk about who's the boss, it really, that part of the brain that's sending messages, often those messages could conflict with each other. So I might think I see a bear, but I know in my mind that I'm in the mall and it couldn't have been a bear. So I've got the survival message, and then I've got reason. And what we want is for, as a brain to develop and mature, for the reason, all the neocortex parts, those blue parts of the brain, to be in charge, so that we use logic and reason above everything else. It doesn't mean those other messages aren't important, but often they're flawed or distorted. And our logic and reason is what helps us sort those messages out. So we know that if we're hungry, we don't have to fight for food. We know logic says, I can eat when I get home. I'm not going to die right now if I don't eat. When our kids experience trauma, different parts of the brain actually are affected by the trauma. And so each of these three areas, these message centers, are affected by it. And most of our kids who end up with trauma, their survival brain and their emotions brain are the boss. And the logic part doesn't develop healthy because things have happened during the survival and the emotion stages of development. I know it's kind of like all just, so I'm going to lump those together. I'm going to lump the survival and the emotion brain and call that the downstairs brain. This is a term that is often used in trauma affected programs. The downstairs brain and the upstairs brain being this upper part of our brain that can use reason and logic. Now, what happens when our kids are experiencing some sort of trauma during the developmental stages, the survival and the emotions are strengthened, they're heightened, because it's a form of survival that we have to listen to those messages, so they become very, very loud in our brain and they become the boss. And as you see kids develop, we see that they continue to be regulated by the downstairs brain, where it's emotion and fear that is determining their behaviors. And that when we try to talk to them with logic and reason, it doesn't make any sense. That part of the brain is not the boss. So that those messages are much softer, quieter, lost, disorganized, and the downstairs brain messages have become much stronger. So as we're talking about developing a brain in basically these phases, and again, I'm oversimplifying, they do overlap, but if you're building a building and you have, you've got the foundation and you've got each floor of a building, if there's one part in the building that's messed up, that receives some sort of trauma or is disorganized or not strong enough or too strong, or doesn't add up architecturally, the measurements, not only does it affect that one area, it affects everything that's built on top of it. And that is the big concept for trauma affected brain, is that we can see things happening in the brain, sometimes in their teens or in their young adult life, that we actually can link back to trauma that the brain has experienced even decades ago, but it's not going to show up at the time. It might show up, and it might show up in different ways. So we might have sensory processing issues with a child, but then as that child becomes a young adult, we see that they have problems with organization or learning new habits and things like that. So a lot of times the brain, we're understanding these things that happened to the brain helps us to then decipher what's going on. And this is just another example of, if you think down here in the corner where there might be a brain has endured some sort of trauma, it could be neglect or abuse. It could be something like ear infections, or the family went through a tornado and lost their home. I mean, it could be all kinds of things. Acid reflux for a baby, any kind of thing where they have a need and it's not met. The need is not met. That releases cortisol, the stress hormone, into the brain. And what that stress hormone does is it numbs the thinking part of our brain. Extended releases of cortisol have a permanent effect on that front part. It's called an acid wash. So when a child has any kind of repeated or prolonged trauma, that continual hormone of cortisol, that continual acid wash, not only just numbs the thinking part of the brain, but can actually do damage. And we'll look at some pictures of brains in just a minute. So some of the things that happen when the thinking part of the brain becomes, the emotions and the survival part of the brain become the boss. Our kids often have sensory processing issues. They're not receiving messages. So something that might supposedly just feel soft, the brain is not getting that message. It's distorted, and so it might feel harsh to them, or they might not feel pain when they should, and then a tiny little scratch or something can be the end of the world. Again, we're thinking that logically doesn't make sense, but when we understand that the brain has intentionally numbed the prefrontal cortex so that it doesn't experience this trauma over and over again, then we can see the long-term damage. So the brain has difficulty with impulse control. Again, those are driven by the survival part of the brain and the emotions part of the brain. We see fear-based behaviors that don't seem to make any sense. The fight, flight, or freeze is fairly common analysis. This additional one here is one that TBRI started to add, where our kids can be manipulative to try to work towards getting someone to be on their side, because ultimately they don't trust. And so so they've added this other F here, so fight, flight, freeze, or friend, meaning I'm going to try to get you under my control. I'm going to try to get you to be my buddy so that I can control you and I can be in charge. The brain becomes unable to soothe itself, to calm there's alpha waves, beta waves, all these waves, our brain is electric. And so to calm itself down, the brain has to be able to shift. And those are messages that come from the thinking brain, and they get drowned out by the survival messages and the emotional messages. And we actually end up with a traumatized brain has a very distorted view of reality. So we can hear our kids saying things like, "You don't love me," and yet all we do is loving things for them. Or a child who thinks they're hungry all the time, if they haven't had food in past, and that has affected their thinking part of their brain. So oftentimes, just because they think something is a reality, we can see that the prefrontal cortex isn't working as it should, because it's seeing reality in a distorted way. the brain becomes hijacked. This is a term actually Dan Siegel uses a lot, where the downstairs brain becomes the boss. The signals that are coming from the downstairs brain are stronger and louder, and the upstairs brain isn't able to receive those messages or is no longer able to regulate those messages. Have you guys seen the Dan Siegel flip the lid, the hand thing here that I've got pictures of? Okay, I'll just go real quick. He uses the hand as just a visual image, where our wrist here and our palm is the brain stem, and the amygdala, the survival part of the brain. And then our thumb is the amygdala, which is where fear comes from, and all of our emotions. And then we've got the outer part of the brain on the outside, which is the logic, thinking, reasoning part. But what happens is when our kids, when this part of the brain has been affected by the trauma, he calls it flipping your lid, which means that this part, the thumb, pushes the prefrontal cortex out, and it becomes the pervasive driving force in the brain. It's helpful sometimes to have kids understand what this is, that, you know, even though you feel like your emotions are so big, they're not the only thing going on in your brain. And we're going to work on, you know, trying to get that part, because that part should be controlled by the cortex all around it. And that's the goal. And that's so often we talk about parents who, when we flip our lids, we let our emotions, you know, drive us. But those parts really are designed to be regulated by the outer part of the brain. And trauma, you know, some sort of glitch from trauma then affects all the other parts of the development of the brain. This is, to me, one of the most helpful pictures I've ever seen, where you can literally see experiences really do change the makeup of the brain. So you can see several things. These temporal lobes here on the sides that are circled, that's where cause and effect, that's where our brain uses that function of cause and effect. So if I scream, someone will come. If I touch a hot stove, it's going to hurt. If I don't clean my room, I'm going to get in trouble. So as one of the things that trauma, one of the first things in a brain that trauma affects is that ability for cause and effect, which really is a logical function, right? It's thinking, it's forethought, it's long-term gratification. I may want to touch this now, but I know that it won't be worth it later. All those things come from using logic and reason. So you can physically see not only that actually part of the brain here in those areas doesn't even show up on these scans, but you can also see even the coloring here, where the abused brain, you just see muter, is that a word? Colors. The colors are muted. There's not as much activity. And this area up here is that prefrontal cortex, the logic, reasoning, and it's just not working very well compared to what you would see in a normal brain. Actually, there are other pictures of brains where you can literally see that an abused brain or a neglected brain is actually smaller. It's actually physically smaller. The cool thing about the brain, of course, is that if experiences can change it in a negative way, then positive experiences can change it as well. I think the term they use, the brain is plastic, which of course I first thought of a plastic spoon, and I don't really get that, but the whole idea that it can move and change. And if you think about how the body adapts to things, you think about like kids nowadays, right? They type everything, but a lot of us were kids. We had to write everything. And a lot of us have calluses here on our middle finger from the way we hold our pen. Now, if that comes from repetition, where the body is adapting to a stressor, and the body is adapting in a way to where it can survive. So I'm not wearing myself down to the bone. I'm actually building up skin so that my body can adapt and survive to that stress. So our brains, in the sense, are the same way. If I stopped writing for a long period of time, that callus would go away. It might take some intervention, some, fancy essential oils or something rub in there to encourage the body to let that go, that's not necessary anymore for survival. Well, cortisol is one of the things that is necessary for a brain to survive a trauma. So our brains get stuck in that hypertension, hypervigilant mode where they're constantly functioning, and that cortisol damages the brain. And as the brain then develops with these glitches, the damage that the trauma has done, it affects the entire body. So our nervous system, our immune system, all those things are affected because our brain is working with these glitches in them. They're working with these wounds. And because our brains are plastic, they adapt. And so we see behaviors that don't make any sense. We see behaviors that are completely fear-driven or that aren't logical at all. And it's interesting how cause and effect is one of the first ones where our culture is very consequence-based in the way that we deal with kids, with each other really, but kids in school, kids at home. If you get A's, you get ice cream. If you get F's, you can't go to Dollywood with the family. I mean, it's all just very consequence-based, but that requires cause and effect thinking. That requires a kid to think through long-term gratification. I'm going to work hard now because I'm going to get a reward later. And a brain that's been through trauma can't function that way. Sometimes we want to say to kids, calm down. And of course, that's using logic and reason, right? But if we understand that their brain isn't able to short term, now their brains can eventually over time, but short term we see the brain doesn't have the ability to function that way. So then co-regulation and some of the other calming, techniques and exercises and things that we do that are more trauma aware come into play. If we just think you're just being impossible, it's not really a thing. There's a reason why our kids are struggling with things that seem logical and easy and reasonable to us. And when we can actually see that they're working with wounds, it can help us in understanding just even to just say, why are they acting this way? Or why do they keep saying these ridiculous things? Why are you freaking out when you got a tiny little cut, but last week you had a fever of 102 and you didn't say a word, and the complexity of the brain is so amazing. It's way more, than I can understand. But when we have basically an overactive amygdala, the amygdala again is the source of emotion and fear. As it's developing in an overactive state, and it continues to stay that way, just like my callus will continue to stay that way until we are doing some proactive work to calm it down, because it's adjusted. This is how kids who go through trauma survive, because their amygdala is overactive. It keeps them alive through a trauma. But once they come out of a trauma and they're in a safe place, that amygdala is still going strong because that's how it developed. So some of the things that happen with the overactive amygdala, they don't feel safe ever. It's that feeling of, you get home from work or you've done some big job and you just want to go, I don't want to pay attention to anything. Their amygdalas don't function that way. They're paying attention to everything all the time. That's exhausting, but they have to stay in that state all the time. Hypervigilant, always looking to see what's the next thing that's going to hurt me. The brain, like I said, is unable to calm down, rest, or sleep. So it's always active. It's always firing. We see this with the lack of imagination. In order to imagine something, you kind of have to let go of reality and put yourself into a different place, or imagination is, such a mental exercise. The brain is too busy. Reality is too important right now. So if you're in a dangerous situation, you're not going to sit there and dream about, walking on the beach. You've got to pay attention to what's around you. But imagination is one of the things that develops a brain. It stimulates parts of the brain in the cortex that are developing. So when our kids can't have an imagination, they're actually then limiting further development. Again, this is that same concept where because there's a wound here, it affects all the other parts of the brain. Our kids have an inability to learn for the same reason. The amygdala is very busy. It's sending all the messages, and our kids are not able to let go of their safety in order to concentrate on anything else. The biggest one is the inability to regulate, and we see this with a lot of severe ADHD brains where they're constantly, fidgeting, and they have to be running around and flipping around. And some of that is typical kids as their brain is developing. But what we see is these brains get stuck, always wanting motion and chaos and stimulus. Some kids avoid stimulation, and some kids are seeking it all the time. Either way, they're not able to regulate when it's appropriate, when it's not. And for the brain to take charge and send the signal that says, right now you have to hold still, even though you feel like moving. And this often makes sense when we see a child doing this, but our instinct is to want to force them to act in a certain way. Again, if we have a brain that's got these wounds, they can't do those sorts of things. So those are some of the things that the amygdala can interfere with regular normal behavior and development. When we see, when our kids have this overactive amygdala, some of the big changes that happen in the body regulating itself, the nervous system, some of the big ones are hormone levels, which if any of you know anything about hormones, it just absolutely affects everything from their physical appearance to weight to acne and things like physical things like that, but also fear, irrational thoughts. A lot of those things when we have our hormones are unregulated, that it just affects lots of different areas, that the outcome of that. But I'm kind of focusing on the changes in the brain. The hormones, some of these hormones like GABA and we think of serotonin and those kinds of things, that these neurons that the brain uses to send messages back and forth and commands. The brain's unable to do that because the development of those message systems is messed up. The immune system is really affected. And this is what's really interesting, is that actually a lot of our kids get sick a lot more. Their immune systems limp along. But what's amazing about the brain is actually some of these kids are the opposite, where they have super hyper immune systems. And we have lots of families who have kids who never get sick, but their brains have, again, it's that adapted, in order to survive, their brains have put more into developing their immune system. So we actually see both. We see kids who get sick a lot and struggle, but we also see kids who have these like superhuman immune systems and can go their entire childhood and never get a fever. But a lot of times that is connected to the trauma that their brain has been through. Neurological functions, so sleep is a big one. Things like imagination, a lot of things like that will see deficits in the way that their brain is working. Regulation is the key one that ends up being frustrating for those of us who are interacting with them, to where they're not going to be able to calm themselves down. They're not going to be able to gauge what's appropriate in a situation. So they may be laughing and giggling and you're at a funeral, but they're not able to regulate what's going on in their brains and restrain that and push that to a later time. Epigenetic changes are really the physical changes that happen. So if our kids have been through some sort of trauma, the brain is focusing on survival. And that child might have been 6 feet, but because of what was happening when they were little, that brain has focused on survival. and that child, whether it's malnourishment or abuse or anything, it can have changes in how thick their hair is, how tall they are, how strong their bones are, how their intestinal tract works. Like literally those kinds of changes in the brain will affect all those kinds of things in the body. It's such a central part of, it tells everything else how to work. And oftentimes what we do is we diagnose all these different issues. So I'll hear a parent say, my child has ODD, PTSD, ADHD, and they're bipolar. And I'm thinking, I'm not sure that, when we look at the brain and we've got a wound, these are symptoms that come from that wound. And when we can focus on helping the brain heal from those things, a lot of those things maybe go away, but at least are lessened and begin to kind of look more alike as far as they're connected to this part of the brain. So example here, my daughter, we got her at birth, but she had very traumatic in utero, and she was struggling academically. And some of them were, they were able to diagnose, well, there's dyslexia and, there's some auditory processing. But I couldn't help thinking it's got to be connected to all of the trauma that she's come with, because she had a lot of attachment difficulties as well. We did a program called Neuro Reorganization, where we went back and did exercises that mimicked things that a baby would do, like crawling and sensory type exercises that stimulated those parts of her brain. And within 6 months of doing these exercises, she jumped 2.5 grade levels, because her brain was starting to change the habits that it had established for her survival and focus on new ones and grow those, new and develop with those. So some of them really are reversible and are connected to what our kids have gone through and how that's affected the brain. Again, we always come back to experiences change the brain. So all these negative experiences have had these effects on the brain. But then, positive experiences can too. We talk about the brain talking, sending out messages. I could talk about, we got neurons and neural pathways and all those brain words, but I prefer really to try to think more practically about it. So these lines of communication in our brain, where they send messages of what our body is supposed to do, or how we're supposed to move our arm, or to put our sock on, or calculate a math figure. Repetition over and over again makes these pathways in the brain. So just like in a forest or the woods, if you walk the same path every time over and over, it wears that out, makes a groove, and it becomes easier and easier every time. I let my dogs out. They go this way first. They run the back of the fence before they go into the yard. And then, so there's this little groove now around the edge of the yard. The pathways in our brain that communicate to each other are the same way. And really, we call those habits, what do we have to do to break a habit? We have to do something over and over and over again, a different way. We're creating a new groove. When our kids go through these traumas, when their brain is developing, what it does is it develops these pathways to where they're survival pathways. So they're distorted, they're not really organized. And as we grow, we begin to develop better, more efficient pathways in our brain, the message centers. So these messages might be, if it's really cold outside and my brain feels that, it's going to tell my body my heart to slow down so that my blood stays closer to my heart. It's going to, all these messages get sent out. That hurts. It means my brain is sending the message that says, pull away from that. So some of these can be, our kids have these message pathways that are distorted because they have had all of these wounds and glitches in them in the earlier years. So we think, how hard can it be? I've said, put your socks on and then put your shoes on. And yet those two messages can't be held together, the brain starts sending all kinds of different messages in different directions. And oftentimes we can even just see it. It's not clicking. You can see that there's this look on their face like, I know you're saying words, but they're not computing in my brain. And we think sometimes these things are so simple. Just do this equation. I've showed you 5 times how to do it, but those messages aren't being sent to the right place. Oh, my little picture is too big. Look at that. Sorry about that. Messages get unorganized, misdirected, or even lost. So the logical statement, if you touch that, it will hurt, so don't touch it. By the time that message goes from, them hearing it through all these pathways and very disorganized methods for the brain to communicate messages to each other. These neural pathways change all the time. So a person who does alter their behavior, it begins to alter their neural pathways as well. So even our kids who have gone through a trauma where it's affected their brain in a certain way, and they've developed these misdirected pathways, then end up maybe coming into a foster home where things are done completely different. And they're beginning to develop new neural pathways. What's interesting though, is that if the brain has had these disorganized message centers, so many messages get filtered through that disorganized message center. And we have to be more proactive about the brain than most of us are. Most of us don't really understand so much of what the brain does. I mean, I don't really either, just the things that I've learned through TBRI mostly, but correcting and helping our children's brains to heal means that they have to also be healed through experience. Experience is how they got the glitches. So setting our kids up for success and repetitive success, so they're experiencing something over and over and over, is actually physically changing the brain. And what they've seen in these scans, for example, the scans of the brain earlier, is that after kids are in a healthy place and they're beginning to be proactive about reestablishing pathways that are more direct and more organized and more capable and efficient, is that these parts of the brain start to light back up. They start working again. They start filling out those gaps that weren't there before. So that's, to me, it's always very exciting to see that kind of effect when you can see the results in their behavior. So that's sort of just a very quick synopsis. There's really 2 concepts here. One is understanding how the brain develops the 3 parts, what they do, and how the inner parts affect the outer part. And how our objective is to help the upstairs brain be the boss. Another terminology that can help is a lot of people say you take the high road or the low road, and meaning the upper brain versus the lower brain. Front and back, some people use that expression, although back, it's not really back as much as it is, the base of your brain. But if we're understanding and we can identify that the trauma has affected their brain in a way that they are acting based out of the downstairs brain as being the boss, then that can help us, obviously, when we're interacting with them and understanding, there is no why to some of the behavior that they have. So that's one concept, is understanding the 3 parts of the brain and how they develop on top of each other. And the other concept is understanding those pathways that our kids have, that the brain is plastic, the plasticity of the brain, and that these have developed over time, over repeated experiences, and that repeated experiences, the brain will adapt to those and change to those. So basically those 2 things are kind of the big 2 things about trauma in the brain. We've got those developmental things that show up even years later, and then understanding the pathways and the message center, understanding the brain as a message center, that it's not able to communicate as well with each other. So we got a late start. I kind of flew through a couple things, but has anybody got any questions or anything to share? Experiences or?
I could share, but it'd take an hour. I will say from my education and things, a lot of what you're talking about is familiar and recognizable. And the way I think about when I'm working with people with trauma is I always think of like the pathway you're talking about in the woods, kind of like, in my mind, it's like a bike path. And when you're on the path, if you think about it like things that you do automatically, you probably take the same way home from work every day. And you get to the point where sometimes you're like, wow, how did we get home? I don't even remember driving. It's that, that the repetitive stuff. And it just helps to remember, like you said, the repetition because when they're experiencing that trauma, it's that repetitious, a lot of times it's those negative thoughts inside. I like to use mantras to help positive cognitions, repeat it over and over. So you can unlearn the negative things that you're saying about yourself a lot of the times when you've been through trauma. But no, I really appreciate, that was really enjoyable because it's got my mind going with all kinds of things.
Yeah, and if you think about those pathways for a healthy brain, that pathway is it's the shortest, most direct, efficient way from one side to another, right? From one place to another. So if we think about our brain sending a message from that is cold to don't touch it, or that's hot, don't touch it. That's a direct thought. But what happens in our kids' brains is that actually ends up going back here to, will I get in trouble, to here to, do I think it'll be fun, to here. So it's an extremely inefficient path that goes in many different directions. But that's the path that they're used to it going in. So they're gonna do that, So it's often, that's kind of why I had that picture of the maze, to where sometimes you're just thinking, how in the world did you get from me telling you to go put your shoes on to you're outside jumping on the trampoline or something, that's completely unrelated. So those pathways are extremely inefficient and garbled.
Yeah. And I always think too, like, because you talk about the chaos, I mean, they're comfortable in the chaos because that's what they know if they've been through a lot of trauma. And so in order to get the messages through, sometimes you have to slow everything in the environment, calm everything down so the emotions aren't acting as heavily, and you can focus on short steps instead of, go get your shoes, then do this, go get your shoes, then they do that, then the next step.
Yeah.
Then the next step.
Yeah.
Just slow it down so that it's not so overwhelming, because
you're setting them up for success. Go get your shoes. It was a successful experience. So then those positive thoughts, I did it. I did what I was supposed to do. And the more they can have those successes, the more those pathways, like you said, are developed to where we have to set them up to where they can do it. And that does mean, a lot of our families, we have to tell them their kids, after years of trying to make their kids happy, they've got toys out the wazoo and the chaos in their room. And so having them pull everything out of their room so they have a calm environment, so you can focus on this one thing. This one thing is, do not pull the sheet off your mattress. We're not gonna worry about anything else in life. You're going to focus on, one thing. And that sets their brain up to have a success. And those experiences are so powerful and they need them so badly.
I just wanted to add, I had talked to Sandy because I had taken this training as an educator this year. And I was so blessed by your presentation. I felt like it had such great information in it. I was also a little sad that the presentation I went through didn't go through this. It focused a lot on the trauma that students go through. And as an educator, it's so difficult to hear about those traumas and understand, okay, so I know those traumas. I've like heard these traumas before, but what does that mean? And I feel like you broke that down really, really well, because I have a lot of students where, I'm told to do something, creative, for example, give them all of these options. And as a kid who grew up in trauma and didn't have any imagination, I had to develop, some creativity. I didn't know how to create. You could tell me create this and I had no idea. And I felt, negative about that. And so, as an educator, I've tried to compensate for maybe a lack of creativity, but I didn't understand that came from a trauma. I just thought, my personality is like that. And I've developed it, but again, they haven't. And so let me just do this. And so just to hear about, the mixed messages and, what you mentioned about the utero, because like me and my siblings are adopted, and there was a lot of abuse in the utero that my mom had to deal with as an adopted mom. And so, while we might not have experienced certain things, we still had a lot of, I remember my mom telling us to calm down, and I remember as a kid thinking, I don't know how. And having, as an adult to learn, okay, well, this is how I calm down. So as an educator, when my kids are really overwhelmed, I typically don't tell them to calm down. And that was just something that I didn't understand fully, came from the trauma mind. I just thought it's these kids and it's me. And so it was really nice to see, in your presentation, how you really talked about the closed fist and the upstairs and downstairs. And, I lead a group of students, which quite a few of them have experienced some severe trauma. And I think that this would be good for them to know, because I think sometimes it's so difficult for them to be in a classroom with so many different kids that have not experienced trauma. I'm very blessed to work in a school with privileged students who have mom and dad and have, stable backgrounds and no drugs. But then I have a few other kids who have experienced those things. And when they see themselves in the classroom with other kids and they see these kids be creative and they see these kids go into, advanced placement classes and IB classes and things like that, and they don't get to experience that, I can tell them it's not permanent. Like what you're experiencing right now is not permanent. And that's just really cool. So I'm excited to share this stuff with them. I would love your PowerPoint if you wouldn't mind, so that I can share some of this stuff with them, because, this stuff's just not being talked about. Creativity is spoken about as something that you're born with. And if you're not born with it, well, tough luck, and intelligence is taught to them in a way that's fixed. Either you're really good at English and you're really good at math, or you're not, and you're just not school material. So I think just learning some of these things would be very powerful.
Yeah, and our kids feel dumb because they can't learn at the same rate that a person who hasn't been through trauma, but they're not. It is so, I do think that's, and I would love to get more into how to help them. Like that's my passion. That's what I love to do. This one, I really just sort of try to focus on what it's doing to the brain. But there's so much more that, and like you said, the fact that you don't tell your student to calm down, that's just blah, blah, blah. It's like Charlie Brown or the teacher, want. That doesn't make sense to them because their brain isn't equipped to do that. But to co-regulate with them, which means that that they're all hyped up. And so you begin the deep breathing. If we have somebody who's looking and making eye contact with us and they're deep breathing, it makes us do it. We mimic what we see, right? So if we're just deep breathing with them, we're not telling them to calm down. We're just demonstrating, we're co-regulating with them. They're going to adapt those things. But if we just say calm down, they just feel like either a bad kid, or they don't care because it doesn't mean anything, or they're a failure. They're dumb. They can't do it. I remember my daughter saying, "Why was I born bad?" And I'm thinking, "You were born bad," but that's how she felt, just because she couldn't behave the same way her brothers did. And of course, in those early years, we didn't understand it. We just did everything wrong. But once we learned to understand that what your brain is dealing with is preventing you from doing those things, but it's not that there's something wrong with you or that, you're a bad kid and you weren't born bad. But I love that you were saying that just not say calm down, just like that drives me nuts. I can't stand when anybody tells me to calm down anyway, but makes me
And
more
I feel like
angry.
if educators understood this more, because we were just having a conversation and it was between teachers, and I was telling one teacher, I said, I put directions up. I clearly highlighted what they needed to do. And they still asked me, what do I do? And so I told her, I said, I don't know why I give directions. I might as well just, speak everything. But then if I speak it and I don't write it, then they still don't get it. And I feel guilty now because as we were talking about, we were laughing because we're like, why can't they just read the directions? But I wonder, just especially the kids that were asking the questions, how many of them, I know personally some of the trauma some of them have been through, but I realized that I wasn't as sensitive as maybe I could be. I try not to show it to them, but I think even among teachers, if we understood some of this a little bit better, because again, all we're told is, their prefrontal cortex, their limbic system is on overdrive, their amygdala is on overdrive, their logical thinking is not present. But as far as what that means, and I've been an educator for 5 years, never been told what that means. So I do appreciate your presentation, because it's just not, because we think, well, what can we do, right? Like, they've been through XYZ, what can we do? And then we feel like, well, then why do we assign them anything? Let's just not assign them anything. Let's just pass them through. And so I've been a part of teams that have passed kids through, because we're just like, the kid is doomed, but at least he'll get his high school diploma, and at least he'll be set off, and we feel so hopeless, because we're just like, well, we hope we can do the best we can. And we have, counselors, and we have psychologists, and we have, university professors talking to us, and none of them tell us these things. They just tell us, don't be so hard on the kid. You don't know what they're going through. Be patient. And, after this 10th time of telling Johnny to write his name on the paper, and come in and sit down and do it this way, it can be really frustrating. And most teachers, we just throw our hands up and say, this is hopeless. This kid's not going to get it. And I've been guilty of that with a couple of kids. I'm ashamed to say that, but I've been guilty with some students just saying that, because I didn't know. I mean, I knew some of the trauma, but I thought you could choose better, because I've seen some kids choose better. But what I don't remember is that it took time for them to choose better.
Yeah, and even a direction we tell a child, like you said, I want you to write your name right here. Or more behavior where do not turn the light off when you come into the room, Well, we think we've told them once, that should be enough. But again, if you think about those pathways, if that child is used to turning the light off because they want the attention and they need that affirmation and they want the control, like there's lots of reasons why they're doing it. But that pathway has been established. And we think, I told you once, and now if you do it again, you're going to get in trouble. But our kids need to hear these things repetitiously over and over and over in order to develop new pathways. If we understand what's going on in the brain, it helps us, like you said, and not just think this kid's doomed, or, like they used to say when I was a kid, well, he's just a bad seed. There's no such thing as a bad, it just burns me out when I hear that.
So with your daughter with your daughter hearing about these things, how has this helped her self-image and her activity and performance in school?
Well, we had the big jump when we did those, a lot of those exercises to try to help. Specifically, she still has some severe learning disabilities. And so that's always been a challenge for her. But being able to adjust how she learns to be more, to try to think more along the lines of how she functions. And, she'll say, I don't have school smarts, but I have art smarts. Or she has color smarts. She's a phenomenal photographer. She didn't fit in the academic box. And I was able, since I homeschooled, I was able to adjust a lot of things for her that way. But just for her in general to not feel like she's a terrible, bad person. And as we began to do more of kind of the techniques that are in TBRI, I hadn't really discovered TBRI at that point, but a lot of those techniques is we were able to set her up for success. Her self-esteem grew, her confidence grew, her ability for empathy grew, for trust and relationships. And so all those things, then she's safer. And felt safety is a really big thing in TBRI, where you can tell a child they're safe, but if they don't feel safe, it doesn't matter. You could tell them until you're blue in the face. They have to feel safe. And so if they don't feel safe, anything else we're trying to teach them or do with them is just gobbledygook. It's not gonna help. So trying to figure out how can I help them to feel safe? And that's consistently meeting their needs, out meeting their needs, and then let me show you. So instead of just giving instructions, we're walking alongside them. I think that's one of the things that's so cool about Rise Up, is that you're getting into these practical, let me walk with you through this. I'm not just going to tell you what to do and then leave you, and that's part of co-regulation too, where instead of just asking you to perform, do something. So like in academics, where my other children, I wouldn't have done their math problems for them, because that's what it would feel like from an old school perspective. I would do them with her, and I would do the steps, and she would then learn as we did them together. But then, so in the beginning, I'm academically succeeding and she's coming along with me. And then I begin to invite her into it more and more of the process, to where then she has been experiencing success enough to where her brain is capable of doing it. And every time we do something, the next time is easier. You're really super nervous about going to the gym. You're self-aware. Everybody's going to be looking at me. I don't know how to use the equipment. The next time you go, it's a little bit easier, right? The next time you go, it's a little bit easier. It's the same with the brain. So in academics, a lot of trauma affected kids get more assistance, in the sense where they're walking through those processes with them, setting them up for little tiny successes, and those then improve their ability to succeed the next time. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's some of what we went through with Abby.
It does, because like I said, I think in education we've made the mistake of focusing so much on the trauma and not on its effects and what we can do about it. And I think a lot of our kids have, I can just speak from the kids that I've taught, a lot of my kids don't know these things. They know the trauma. They can tell you. I have a child, for example, who she will tell me, Miss Johnson, I'm on medicine for this and this and this and this, and I have this wrong with me, and I cannot do this and I cannot do that. And it's like, well, what can you do? What are you capable of controlling? She doesn't see that. And what's intriguing about it is that she comes from a very high profile home. Her parents have been married for over 20 years. She has 4 siblings, but out of all of them, she has the most behaviors that are associated with trauma. And so while I don't know her story and I don't know what she's been through, on the outside looking in, there should not be as many things, but there is so much in her. And she just has accepted it, and she's accepted her symptoms, and she's accepted her behaviors, and she's accepted that she won't be a certain way, but she's accepted it as far as like, I can improve, I can't be better, I am who I am. And so this excuses any bad behavior that I have. This excuses any decisions I make. I'm not responsible for any of them. And she finds herself in lots of constraints, because she feels like, no, I am smart, but I don't have control of my brain. And no, I am smart, but I can't control the way that I'm reacting right now. I know better, but why do I keep doing this? And it's interesting, the conversations that she'll ask me. And when you said that friend, freeze, the fight, flight, freeze, and friend, now that I understand that, I can watch that a little more, because she has made me her friend, and it has been to her detriment in a way, because she has used me as a scapegoat to not do things. Well, I don't have to go to this class because Miss Johnson will take care of me, and that kind of thing. And I didn't realize that's what she was doing until you said something, and I thought, that sounds very familiar. So
yeah, it's interesting hearing you from an educator, as a parent, when the kids are in that functioning with that friend, that we actually call that mommy shopping, where they're looking for, who's going to be my next foster family. And I want to pick someone who I can control so that I can keep myself safe. It's that same mechanism in the brain, where it's a way to try to be in control, because that's the only way they feel safe, but yeah.
Well, I won't take up any more of your time, but thank you.
Sure. TBRI has actually, have you heard of the Attachment and Trauma Network, ATN? They're based out of Atlanta.
I believe so. I think that might have been one of the trainings because I thought it was TBRI that trained us, but the material didn't look the same. No, the material didn't look, they focused more on ACEs.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if it was exactly the same one, but when Sandy had originally said it, I did think that was the organization, but they focused so much on ACEs. They didn't really focus on fully the effect of ACEs. They just spoke about, these are the adverse childhood experiences. This is what they are. This is how you know if they've experienced it. If they've experienced, 3 or more, then they're a trauma child, which means that their prefrontal cortex is overdeveloped. And that's it. That was like the end of the training.
Yeah, the ACEs is a drop in the bucket. I would encourage you, if you're interested in, TBRI has a lot more of the practical outworkings of how do we communicate with them? How do we, like, eye contact and touch and all, it's really some good practical things. I'm going to do a caregivers training starting next week. It's 8 weeks, 1 night a week. If you're interested in that to explore more of the concepts behind how trauma affects the brain and how we can reverse those effects.
Yeah, that would be great. What days are
that? Can you give me your email? I'll send you some information.
Yeah. Denise Ramos Johnson. So DeniseRamos Johnson @gmail.com.
Okay. I'll drop you some information about it.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to meet you and talk to you.
Yeah, pleasure to meet you guys.
So
Thank you.
Amy and Jeannie both said they were sorry that they had to step off. And Amy wanted me to share really quick. She messaged me and said that the foster kids and the adopted kids and the at-risk kids definitely have trauma, but also what we consider the privileged kids also can come from trauma. She said that she came from that and she lacked all those things that you're talking about, creativity and the ability to think things through and to be able to be creative. And she said it was because her parents were such over perfectionists that it caused her kind of a PTSD type thing. And she just wanted me to share that just because that's something she wanted to share before she had to run. And she also said that she would love to talk to you, Denise, about how you found your creativity. And I told her that maybe she could reach out to you on Facebook because you're both on Facebook.
Yeah, or you can give her my email.
Okay. And I did record this and I will share it with all of you guys. So if you want to go back and look at any of it, and her PowerPoint is on that too, Denise, if you want to look at that again.
Yeah,
too.
I can give it to my students. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Would you mind if I shared it with my students, Miss Jeannie?
Sure. Yeah, okay. There's a lot more I would love to share with you to share with them. This was just tip of the iceberg today. There's all kinds of cool stuff, but if you're interested, I'd love to.
School trainings for one of our groups. I would wonder if at some point in the semester, if you could do maybe something after school. Our kids are willing to stay after school to do an online training. And I think they'd be really interested in something like this because we're going through, character and integrity and self-image. And I think if they understand the trauma they faced, then they can have a little more self-compassion. And that's something that we are going to talk about.
Yeah. And awareness is such a key part of doing anything about it. Feeling like I can't control who I am, but once they're aware of, okay, there's some stuff going on in my brain that's understandable, then they get some sense of control back, which is always comforting. Yeah, great. All right. Well, it was great to meet you all.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good evening.
You too.